Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to talk about another book from the International Booker long list for this year. And that is What I'd Rather Not Think About by Jente Posthuma and translated by Sarah Timmer Harvey. And this is a book that really sort of snuck in and took me by surprise in many ways. And I enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I would. I will go a little bit into some spoiler territory later, but I'll try and keep this as spoiler free as possible. But this is really quite an interesting book. The core premise of this book is that we have two twins, and we hear it all through the perspective of one twin, who is nicknamed Number Two, or just Two, by her brother. And because he was born first as a part of the twins. And the whole book really examines from the beginning what happens when one twin sort of essentially dies, what happens next in the story. And so right from the beginning, we know that something's going to happen. We know that we will lose a twin as the story goes. But what's so interesting, I think, is how this book approaches it with this very sort of offbeat tone. So the core idea is, we're kind of hearing from this twin as she details sort of the moments she had with her twin brother. And at first these seem relatively innocuous. So she starts talking about how they would sit and watch Survivor, the TV show, together, both the US version and the Dutch version. And this book is mostly set in the Netherlands. It's a book written in Dutch originally. And we see how they have these really innocuous little things they do together. So they will watch Survivor and they'll talk about it, and they'll, they start off by saying things like, "Oh, I love, I love this character, but I hate when they all kind of come in saying, I'm going to play the game," and then later they revise their opinions when they realise that all the people who came in and were just truthful got voted out and left early. So they have things like that in common. There's this sort of recurring thing at the beginning about them visiting the Twin Towers in the US, and they talk about visiting them pre 9/11. And there's something about the way that they look up at buildings and have these conversations. And many of these conversations are about suicide as well, of, particularly the brother saying, "Oh, well, did you know if somebody jumps from a tower, this is what it looks like on impact," or "this is the best way to survive if you fall more than 30 feet," or, all of these sorts of things. And they have these sort of slightly offbeat, bizarre conversations that are very much laced with this sort of darkness. But the book has this sort of jaunty tone that I found really engaging. These very sort of short chapters that feel very episodic, very sort of short, sharp thoughts. And often those really veer between something quite sad and something very kind of quirky or silly. So, a fact about an animal or something else. And at first these seem quite trivial at the beginning of this book. We know that something's going to happen to the twin brother. And so we know that some of the danger and the sort of the struggles with mental health that he's sort of showcasing at that time, we know that something's coming from that. But we also get to sort of sit and enjoy the silliness of everything else, of their thoughts on Survivor, their thoughts on whatever else. And I think the real mastery in this book is the fact that the way that it builds that tone and keeps that tone in many ways, while slowly introducing the darker and darker themes that are happening within it. And again, without spoiling anything, that often looks like Two looking at her brother and thinking, well, what is happening there? What's he going through? And also almost sort of trying to piece together the clues after the act. What does it look like back then? What happened? What really happened? Could he have been saved? And so she looks through all of these things. But again, there's this sort of jaunty, slightly offbeat, almost ironic, detached tone. And I can see why that might be off-putting to a reader, but there's something for me so brilliant about the way that it's handled, where she starts the book kind of saying, we used to do this with Survivor. And then later she is finding more information and she's watching a season of Survivor and can't quite deal with it. And so for me, there's something really heartbreaking and profound about the way that this book purposely sets up that dichotomy, the kinds of ways that in day-to-day life we might sort of jokingly accept a very dark joke or a sort of dark thought from somebody and not necessarily think about what's going on behind it, whereas actually maybe it's masking something much bigger. So this really pleasantly surprised me. I think when I first started reading it, I did not think I would enjoy it this much. But the tone is so interesting. It kind of reads like, to me at least, like somebody is very like chatty and conversational. It's just like, oh yeah, we used to do this, and then this thing happened, and blah blah blah. Oh yeah, and then there was that moment he died, and it just, these sort of heartbreaking moments just sort of peppered into the book. And it's difficult to talk about some more of this without really going into spoilers, even though I think the main spoiler of the brother dying is on the back of the book and is introduced right at the beginning of this book. But I think there are some nuances to that I really want to talk about that I can't really do without going into spoilers. So I'm going to jump into spoilers in just a second. If you need to drop off here, great, totally fine. Feel free to come back afterwards as well, or not. It's entirely up to you. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts regardless, and let's jump into some spoilers. The caffeine, I think, is really hitting as I'm talking. I'm kind of realising I'm going at 1,000,000 miles per hour. So the core thing that I think is worth talking about within a sort of spoiler territory is how the book then reshapes moments from a previous part of the book. So right at the beginning, we know that we have this conversation about the Twin Towers, and, you know, we kind of as the reader know that we're being set up for something to some degree, but it also feels relatively throwaway. Like they're talking about going to New York, looking at the Twin Towers and thinking about how tall they are. We then have a moment later in the book where 9/11 happens and they phone each other and they're talking about it, saying, oh my God, I can't believe it. And at that point, we know that people are jumping off the building themselves to try and rescue themselves and sort of free themselves. And again, this is sort of setting up more and more about what happens later in the book, where we then start getting into conversations around, we almost see the sort of the movement of that. We now see people who go to visit the place where the Twin Towers used to be, and this sort of disaster tourism almost of that. We also start to see the breakdown of a relationship for the main character, her partner Leo. We start to see how things really break down, particularly after the death of her brother, because she suddenly has nothing really to give. Her twin has gone, and this whole idea of somebody knowing you better than anybody, but yet you didn't see that this was about to happen, or you did see it, but you weren't in any position to stop it, is really difficult for her. She sort of jokes that she's the less extreme version of her brother, that, you know, she's vegetarian, he's vegan, she's a bit sad, he took his own life. And there's something about this sort of dark humor of that she just sort of says it and can't really register the profound nature of what she's just said, the sort of how intense a thought that is. And there's something really interesting, I think, about how the book then builds that, because towards the end of the book, we sort of see how she's becoming flatter and flatter. She kind of can't really work out what her identity is, minus her brother, to the point where Leo, her partner, wants to leave her because she is spending all of her time at her brother's place, reading his diaries, trying to understand what has happened, trying to be close to him in any capacity that she can. So she's sort of going through his belongings. She's there reading his diaries, and she can't piece together this person who she thought she would be able to know better than anybody. She can't piece together that she can't understand this one last thing. And the book sort of ends with this sort of breakdown of her relationship with Leo, of him saying, come on, choose, it's him or me, you know, choose your brother who's already dead, or me, your partner who's alive. And she can't answer. She knows that she has to go back and be part of, you know, her process of grieving isn't quite over yet. And I think that's just what's so beautiful about this book, is the way that it really does these gut punch moments, surrounded by this sort of whimsical, dreamlike, sort of silly, absurdist thing. And that beneath there's something really quite interesting lurking that I found really captivating. I thought this was a really well done book. I found myself, it's a very quick read, I think, partly because there are so many chapters and the chapters are very short. I think the longest chapter is about 5 pages. But there's also something about the way this book just unravels this sort of conversational tone, this sort of silly sort of thought, sort of the silly tone of somebody just sat there thinking and going, what about badgers? What about this thing? And this book just builds to this moment. I just thought it was really well done. I'm really quite impressed by what this book has been able to achieve, particularly as it's a book that I did not think that was going to be happening the first sort of 20 pages in. I thought, okay, something interesting's happening here. But there's a quiet sucker punch to this book that I think is very interesting. And I'd be really keen to hear more people's thoughts once they've read it. Anyway, I've been Bob the Booker talking about this book. I hope you've enjoyed the book and the video. If you want to leave any comments, just be mindful of spoilers or anything like that for people who've not read the book yet. But yeah, thank you for stopping by and take care. Speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.